It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the world seemed to pause, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I was sitting on my porch, sipping my coffee, enjoying the peace and quiet. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. The high-pitched whine of an electric cutter shattered the tranquility. At first, I thought it was coming from a neighbor's yard, perhaps someone starting a home improvement project. But as the sound grew louder and more violent, I knew something was wrong. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, and that's when I saw her. Martha, my next-door neighbor, was standing in my backyard, wielding an electric saw like a villain in a low-budget horror film. She was slicing through my carefully built wooden fence, reducing it to splinters. My heart sank as I watched the destruction unfold. Martha looked up, her expression completely unfazed, as if she hadn't just committed full-scale property destruction in broad daylight. "Oh, you're up finally," she said, pushing a chunk of my fence aside with her foot. "This thing was an eyesore. I'm doing you a favor." A favor? I could barely process what I was seeing. My fence, my beautiful, expensive wooden fence that I had installed only a few months ago, was now a pile of discarded planks and jagged edges. Martha stood there, dusting sawdust off her floral print cardigan, looking so smug it made my blood boil. "What the hell are you doing?" I finally managed, my voice rising. She sighed dramatically, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Your fence was ruining the look of the neighborhood. We have a certain aesthetic to maintain, and quite frankly, that ugly wooden thing wasn't cutting it." She waved the saw in the air like a judge handing down a sentence. "So I took care of it. No need to thank me." I stared at her, waiting for her to crack a smile, to reveal that this was some elaborate prank. But no, she was dead serious. My brain short-circuited between anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming urge to throw my coffee at her. "You destroyed my property, Martha," I said, pointing at the wreckage, my hands shaking. "Do you have any idea how much this cost me?" Martha clicked her tongue, shaking her head like I was a slow student who just didn't get it. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just wood. Besides, if you'd put up something more." "I don't know, tasteful, we wouldn't be having this conversation." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The level of entitlement was staggering. "You're paying for this," I snapped. "Every single cent." She let out a laugh, a high-pitched, grating sound that sent my blood pressure skyrocketing. "Oh, please. What are you going to do? Call the cops?" She smirked, crossing her arms. "It's not like I broke into your house. I just did a little landscaping." "A little landscaping?" That's what she called vandalizing my property with an electric saw. My hands clenched into fists as I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen, playing back the video I had just recorded. Martha's smug expression faltered slightly as she heard her own voice declaring that she was doing me a favor. "Oh, that's cute," she said, rolling her eyes. "What, you think you can use that against me?" "I don't think, Martha. I know." She scoffed but didn't say anything. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she realized she had actually gone too far. Minutes later, the cops arrived, their flashing lights reflecting off the remains of my once-perfect fence. I explained everything, even showed them the footage. One officer turned to Martha, who had suddenly switched to her innocent, wide-eyed act. "Officer, this is just a misunderstanding. I was only trying to help." The officer didn't look convinced. "Ma'am, you can't just destroy someone's property because you don't like how it looks." Martha let out a dramatic gasp, clutching her chest as if she'd just been accused of murder. But it was hideous. It was ruining the entire curb appeal of the neighborhood. The officer pinched the bridge of his nose. "That's not how property laws work." I waited, hoping, no, praying, that they'd slap some handcuffs on her, that she'd finally get what she deserved. But Martha, like every entitled villain in a bad movie, knew how to weasel her way out of trouble. The police told her she was lucky this time, that since it was only a property dispute and no one was hurt, she'd only get a warning. A warning. After she had taken a saw to my fence like some unhinged lumberjack. Martha, of course, took this as a victory. "See? No harm done," she said sweetly, giving me a condescending pat on the shoulder before waltzing back to her house like nothing had happened. I stood there, fists clenched, as the cops left. My beautiful fence was in ruins, and Martha had walked away without so much as a fine. But if she thought she had one, she was dead wrong. That was the moment I decided that if Martha hated fences so much, she was going to love my next one. I spent the next few days simmering in quiet rage, replaying the moment Martha destroyed my fence over and over in my head. Every time I walked outside and saw the wreckage she left behind, my blood boiled all over again. She had done this with zero consequences, and what made it worse was the way she smirked at me every time she stepped outside, as if daring me to try something. I knew one thing for certain: she thought she had one. She thought I would just give up, maybe put up another wooden fence, and let her do it all over again. But if there was one thing Martha didn't understand, it was that I wasn't the type to back down. If she thought a simple wooden fence was an eyesore, she was about to experience something far worse. I spent hours researching property laws, neighborhood regulations, and every single HOA guideline I could find. The more I read, the more confident I became. As long as the fence was within my property line, under the height restrictions, and not in immediate lethal danger, I could do whatever I wanted. And what I wanted was to make sure Martha regretted ever touching my fence in the first place. The first step was finding the perfect replacement. A simple wooden fence wasn't going to cut it anymore. No, I needed something stronger, something that wouldn't just keep Martha out but would also send a clear message. After scouring multiple websites, I found exactly what I was looking for: a custom-made metal fence, sleek and impenetrable, with built-in security features. I placed the order immediately, sparing no expense. If Martha thought she could intimidate me into submission, she was about to learn the hard way that I played the long game. When the fence finally arrived, I took my time assembling it, making sure every single panel was reinforced. It wasn't just metal, it was industrial-grade aluminum with a reinforced steel core. The best part? It had a legal but effective low-voltage electric deterrent built into it, not strong enough to cause serious harm, but just enough to deliver a nice little shock to anyone who got too close. To make things even better, I added motion-activated security lights and a set of cameras with a loud alarm that would go off if someone attempted to mess with it. It was, without a doubt, the most advanced fence the neighborhood had ever seen. As I worked on the installation, Martha watched from her porch, arms crossed, her expression shifting from curiosity to deep suspicion. I could feel her eyes boring into me, but I ignored her. She didn't say anything at first, probably assuming that I was putting up another wooden fence, one she could easily destroy again. But then she saw the metal panels. Her jaw tightened the moment she noticed the security wiring. She practically vibrated with anger. "What are you doing?" she finally snapped, marching over to the property line. "What is that?" I didn't even bother looking at her as I tightened the last bolt. "Building a fence, Martha. You know, the one you destroyed." She scoffed, folding her arms. "That doesn't look like a normal fence." I finally turned to her, flashing the most innocent smile I could muster. "Oh, it's just a little upgrade. Since you seem to have an issue with wood, I figured I'd try something new." Her eyes narrowed. "That looks like a prison wall." "Really? I think it looks great. Plus, it's completely legal." I checked. I tapped the metal frame, letting my fingers linger on one of the security features, just to make a point. "And the best part? No more easy destruction. This one's built to last." She made a disgusted noise, clearly realizing that she had underestimated me. "This is an eyesore. You're ruining the neighborhood." I shrugged. "Oh well." Martha stormed off, but I knew this wasn't over. She wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. That night, just as I had predicted, my security cameras caught her sneaking into her backyard, flashlight in hand. I watched the live feed from my phone, barely able to contain my grin. She circled the fence like a vulture, probably trying to find a weak point. Then she did something so incredibly stupid, I almost couldn't believe my luck. She filled a bucket with water. I watched in disbelief as she walked up to the fence and, with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences, tossed the entire bucket onto it. The moment the water hit the surface, the built-in security system activated. A harmless but effective jolt surged through the metal, and Martha let out a shriek that could probably be heard 3 streets away. She staggered back, clutching her hand, and ran inside like a cartoon villain whose evil plan had just backfired spectacularly. I replayed the footage at least a dozen times, each time laughing harder than before. But the real fun came the next morning when Martha emerged, acting as if nothing had happened, except she couldn't quite hide the way she winced when she moved her fingers. I didn't say anything. I just waved at her. She glared and marched back inside. The real battle, however, began when she called the HOA. The moment I saw a group of them approaching my house, clipboards in hand, I knew Martha had pulled some strings. They knocked, plastering on their best fake friendly smiles, and asked to discuss a concern regarding my new fence. I let them talk, let them go on about how it was too industrial looking and not in line with the community's aesthetics. But when they tried to tell me I had to take it down, I pulled out my folder of research and permits. I showed them the exact regulations, the city-approved paperwork, and even the specific HOA rules that allowed it. They had nothing, absolutely nothing. One of them, clearly flustered, muttered something about reviewing the guidelines, but I could tell they knew they had lost. Martha, who had been standing in her yard watching with glee, looked like she had swallowed a lemon when the HOA representatives walked away empty-handed. She stomped inside, slamming her doors so hard it echoed down the street. I had one again. I knew Martha wouldn't let it go, but I also knew something she didn't. Every single time she tried to mess with me, she only made things worse for herself. She had started this war. I was just making sure she finished it the hard way. Martha's fury over my new fence reached a boiling point, and I could feel it in the way she stomped around her yard, glaring at the metal barrier like it had personally offended her. I had won every battle so far, but something told me she wasn't done. Martha wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to escalate, to find new ways to make my life miserable. I knew she would try something reckless, and I wasn't wrong. Late one night, just as I was about to go to bed, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from my security cameras. I opened the app and saw exactly what I had expected. Martha, dressed in all black, sneaking around the perimeter of my fence like some low-budget burglar. But she wasn't alone. She had brought backup. Two men, faces half covered with ski masks, were with her, whispering and gesturing toward my fence. I watched in disbelief as one of them pulled out a wrench while the other carried what looked like bolt cutters. I could barely contain my laughter. Martha had actually hired people to help her take down my fence in the middle of the night. It was the most ridiculous yet entirely predictable thing she had ever done. I tapped into the camera's audio system, clearing my throat loudly before speaking in the most authoritative voice I could muster. I hope you're all ready to go to jail. Martha let out a startled shriek, whipping around in a panic. The two men scrambled to grab their tools, but it was too late. My floodlights blasted on, illuminating the entire yard like a football stadium. The security alarm blared through the night, loud enough to wake half the neighborhood. Martha, caught like a raccoon in a garbage can, started screaming at the two men. "Do something. Shut it off," she shrieked, her voice cracking. One of the men made the unfortunate decision to grab the fence with his bare hands. The moment his fingers touched the metal, a controlled but effective jolt ran through him. He yelped, stumbling backward, shaking his hands as if they were on fire. "It's electrified," he shouted. "No kidding," I said through the speaker. Martha's eyes darted around in pure panic. She hadn't expected this. She thought I would be asleep, that she could dismantle my fence without consequences. She thought wrong. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and that's when true terror crossed her face. "Run," she screeched. The two men didn't need to be told twice. They bolted, disappearing into the night, leaving Martha standing there like a deer in headlights. For a second, she actually looked like she might try to make a run for it too, but before she could, a police cruiser screeched to a stop in front of my house. Two officers jumped out, flashlights shining directly at her. "Hands where we can see them," one of them ordered. Martha's mouth flapped open and closed like a fish gasping for air. This is just a big misunderstanding." The officers didn't look convinced. One of them turned to me, and I simply gestured to the security cameras. "I've got the whole thing on video," I said. She was trying to destroy my fence again. Martha's expression twisted in horror. He trapped me," she wailed, pointing at me like I was the villain. "This is entrapment." The officer looked unimpressed. "Ma'am, trespassing and attempted property damage aren't exactly traps. You do realize we have your actions recorded, right?" Martha tried to argue, but the officers weren't having it. They slapped a pair of handcuffs on her, and for the first time in my life, I saw true panic in her eyes. She tried pleading, insisting that this was all a mistake, but the police had heard enough. They loaded her into the back of the cruiser, and as they pulled away, I could hear her screaming about how this neighborhood had gone downhill. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the now silent yard. It was over. She had finally pushed too far, and this time, there were real consequences. The satisfaction that settled over me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. Over the next few days, news of Martha's arrest spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had been terrorized by her for years came by just to shake my hand. One older man, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, actually brought me a homemade pie. "You did what none of us had the guts to do," he said with a chuckle. "That woman has been a menace since the day she moved in, always stirring up chaos." The neighborhood felt peaceful. The silence was almost unsettling at first. No more unnecessary complaints, no more entitled demands, no more passive-aggressive notes left on doorsteps. It was like the air itself was lighter. To celebrate my victory, I decided to throw a party, a fence war party, as I jokingly called it. I invited everyone, even the HOA members who had tried to shut me down before. To my surprise, most of them showed up, acting as if they hadn't sided with Martha just weeks ago. People took selfies with my fence, laughing about the entire ordeal. Someone even suggested putting up a plaque to commemorate the occasion. I thought about it for a second, then decided, why not? A week later, a small metal plate was installed on the fence. The words etched into it read, "Dedicated to Martha, who inspired greatness." When Martha finally returned, looking thoroughly humiliated, she barely left her house. She didn't make eye contact with anyone, didn't complain about anything, didn't even step near my property. It was like she had finally been deprogrammed. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. One afternoon, as I was watering my plants, I saw her peek out from behind her curtains, eyes darting toward my fence. She must have noticed the plaque because her face turned bright red, and she yanked the curtain shut with a huff. I couldn't help but grin. For the first time since I moved in, I finally had peace. And best of all, I had a fence that was built to last. The fence became a symbol of resilience in the neighborhood. People would walk by and point it out to their friends, sharing the story of how one man stood up to the neighborhood bully and won. It wasn't just a fence. It was a testament to the power of standing your ground and not backing down in the face of adversity. As for Martha, she eventually moved away. The last I heard, she had relocated to a small town where she could start fresh. I like to think she learned a valuable lesson from the whole ordeal, but knowing Martha, she probably just found a new neighborhood to terrorize. But that's not my problem anymore. I've got my peace, my fence, and a story that will be told for years to come. And if anyone ever tries to mess with my property again, they'll quickly learn that I'm not someone to be trifled with. After all, I've got the best fence in town. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.